Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Your Legislators, a production of KRWG Broadcasting. Your Legislators is a public service program providing our viewing audience in southern New Mexico the opportunity to hear about important legislative issues directly from their elected representatives in Santa Fe.
Welcome to Your Legislators. I'm your host, Samantha Sonner. We are joined today with Senator Joseph Cervantes of District 31. Senator, how are you doing this morning?
Well, I'm doing great up here, Samantha. We're close to about midway through the session and things are starting to pick up a little bit.
That's great. So we are almost midway through the session now. What do you think is the most important issue for the legislature this session?
Well, I think the focus right now is, of course, on the state's budget. We're seeing declining revenues with the oil and gas prices going down. Of course, that's great for all of us at the gas pump, but it's bad for the state revenues. And so there's a lot of attention to the state budget, but of course the most important issue is and always should be education.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about education. Now, I know I saw one of your bills, which I found pretty interesting, was that you're trying to lengthen the school day. Could you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yes, next week, Samantha, we're going to roll out what I'm calling Invest 205, which is a program to try and take New Mexico to the highest level in the country for school days. Right now, we're very much in the average at about 180 school days a year, but my goal is to try and lengthen our school day, provide more time on task for students and teachers, and to try and give our primary school children between kindergarten and 5th grade a longer school year.
Now, why give a child a longer school year? What does that accomplish for them?
Well, we've been fortunate to have a great deal of research and study which show that the time the student spends in school is, of course, directly related, ideally, to the time that they're spending learning. And so the goal here is to add additional school days so that we reduce some of the pressures that are coming on students and teachers from excessive testing, for example, and to try and give a greater opportunity in the early years for children to actually spend that time in a classroom learning.
Right now, I would obviously imagine that the biggest opponents of this would be the children, but how do you see this faring in the legislature?
Well, let me first of all hope that that's not right. I mean, my experience as a father, Jennifer and I have raised 3 children through Las Cruces Public Schools. My experience is kids love to be in school if they're being challenged, if they have the right kind of teaching environment, and they're being taught subjects that have some relationship and meaning to those children. And so, I'm not sure that children will necessarily object to having some additional school time if we're making that a meaningful experience.
Okay, great. So are there any other education bills that you're looking at or excited about this session?
Well, the proposal you and I are talking about is going to take some work from all of us. The bill that you're referring to is coupled with a constitutional resolution, constitutional amendment, which will ask the voters to approve the spending that would come with an additional 100 or 205 days, the Invest 205. Which adds 25 days. And so that's going to take all of us to decide as a state whether we want to invest a bit more of the permanent land grant funds into adding some additional school days. And so that I think is going to be a great challenge for all of us to embark on. I'm always interested in water issues and job creation, economic development, and I'll continue to work on those projects.
Okay, great. So now I know one of the education bills that's sparking a lot of controversy this year is the idea of social promotion. Can we talk about that for a little bit?
Sure. As you know, the House has introduced a bill to essentially put the state in charge of deciding whether students advance or not, as opposed to local school districts, local schools, and parents. And as you probably have noted, and I'm sure most of your viewers know, there's a difference between the Democrats and Republicans on that issue.
Right, so could you tell me a little bit about the Democratic side of that issue?
Well, to do so, we have to understand the governor's proposal is to have the state be in charge of deciding who passes and who doesn't in schools. Democrats and our proposal has been to provide for mechanisms where the state has a role, but that role is also paired and coupled with the role of parents and with teachers and principals of schools. The challenges of the governor's approach are many, but primarily during this session, one of the biggest issues has been the cost of that. The bill was originally going to be heard in the House Appropriations Committee so they could make an analysis or determination about the costs of the program, but the governor had that bill pulled out of the Appropriations Committee, so we won't know what the costs of this are going to be. And of course, legislators are probably not going to support that.
Okay, great. So even if this bill does pass in the House, which it is likely to with the majority Republican in the House, how do you see it faring in the Senate then?
Well, I'm certain that the Senate is going to do one important thing that the House didn't do, which is figure out how much this is going to cost. If we're holding back every child at third grade who can't read to a certain reading level, then of course there's going to be a need for additional schools, classes, teachers, and an associated cost with that on all the school districts around the state. So I'm certain that the Senate is going to look very, very carefully at this bill in a way the House didn't do with regard to the costs of any initiative like this.
Okay, great. Now, obviously, another major concern for people is higher education and specifically the cost of higher education. Right now, the lottery scholarship is up in the air with how that is. Could you talk to me a little bit about what's going on in the legislature with higher education?
Well, you must have been talking to my daughters. I have two daughters who are at UNM, so we have college-age children, and we have one daughter who will be soon in college age. So the costs of college are something that Jennifer and I know very well from our own experience. And you're right, the issue of the lottery scholarship and how we fund and finance the lottery scholarship continues to be an important issue in Santa Fe. We've worked very hard the last few years to try and find the additional funding that has been required to maintain that program, and I believe that we'll be able to continue to do so.
Okay, great. So now I know what you said one of the other major important issues was, and especially for southern New Mexico, is water issues. It's lots of people are worried about the drought. Is there any, and you're on the Conservation Committee, so is there any specific water bills that you're looking at that are really going to be helpful?
Well, I have several bills that have been introduced on the subject of water, and I will continue to do so. As you probably know, Samantha, we have farmed in the Mesilla Valley for many generations, and so I understand very well the importance of farming to our community and to the economy in southern New Mexico. In the last few years, farmers have been getting about 4 inches of water out of the river delivery when they're recognized to receive 4.5 feet of water out of the river. So the drought is having some very dire consequences, and we see that. We see the farms that are around our valley that are not being farmed, that are being fallowed, and unless we begin to try and adjudicate our water rights, we're going to continue to have that problem.
Now, what are the steps that we're going to take to adjudicate the water rights?
We have to try and streamline the process now. We've been at the efforts to try and adjudicate water rights around the state for decades. And if you speak to the people that are responsible in the state bureaucracy for doing that, they're telling us it will take decades and decades more to accomplish all of this. And until we can get an understanding of who owns what rights, which is referred to as adjudication, until we know that, there won't be strong, meaningful efforts to try and conserve or to try and put water to other uses. And so we need to streamline the process both with the courts and with the state bureaucracies.
Okay, so really there is not much that can be done in the way of bills to try to conserve water until the adjudication is complete. Is that what you're saying?
No, I wouldn't want to say that. We've done a lot to conserve water, and we'll continue to do so, but the reality is that our laws in New Mexico recognize water rights based on use. And so while those rights are still undefined, there's not a great incentive among big water users, whether it's the university, whether it's the cities, whether it's farmers and others, to conserve water and risk the fact that the state will then say that conservation leads to a lesser right to use that water. And so we need to recognize the right, and once that's done, I'm confident there'll be a stronger effort among big water users to conserve.
Now, do you feel that water is directly tied to economic development in the state?
Absolutely. Absolutely, Samantha. I mean, how do any of us expect to attract businesses to New Mexico, big businesses or others, when there's an uncertainty about our future with regard to water or the costs of water. And so you're absolutely right. Water is hand in hand with not only our future economy, but certainly with our historic and present economy. And again, throughout the state, agriculture is probably one of the bigger industries when we add in the related industries like dairy, cheese production, pecan growing, chili production, and others. When we add all of that together, agriculture is big business in New Mexico.
Okay, right. Now, obviously, you said you had daughters in college. They must be concerned about the job market when they're leaving. What is being done to improve the job market?
Well, they are concerned, and you're right. And I'm sure all the students at New Mexico State and UNM and throughout the state are expressing the same concerns. The fact is that New Mexico, unlike the rest of the country, is not coming out of this recession yet. We are losing jobs. We're losing the right kind of jobs. And in fact, we're losing population in the state, and that's not the message we want to deliver to young people in the state. And so we have to be looking for meaningful efforts to try and build the existing businesses in the state and attract large businesses without losing what we already have. And we're doing seemingly the wrong things by losing businesses in our state.
So are there any bills working their way through the Senate right now that you're excited about for economic development in the state?
Well, a lot of the education programs, I think, are geared toward job creation. We want to be educating young people to the jobs and to the careers which are available and which we want to bring to New Mexico. And then we have job training bills to try and encourage those that are in existing jobs to further their skills and put themselves in a better job position. I'm privileged to represent the Santa Teresa area in New Mexico, among other areas, and Santa Teresa is growing and doing well because of its good geographic location to Mexico and Texas. And we need to be looking at those businesses and trying to grow what is already working in southern New Mexico.
Okay, great. Now, you mentioned education focusing on trying to get kids to want to go into the jobs that are necessary in New Mexico. Could you talk to me a little bit about that? What jobs are necessary and what jobs should kids be looking at?
I think we need to be looking at what New Mexico has to offer the rest of the country, and clearly renewable energy is something that we can offer. Certainly we've put investment into aerospace, things like the spaceport and so forth. There are certain things that New Mexico is associated with and always will be associated with, and so we should be making sure that our young people understand that fields and careers in engineering, aerospace, energy, and careers of those kind that we know are going to be an area where New Mexico can lead, that young people realize there's great opportunities there. And then, of course, we're always looking to healthcare professions and others where our growing population will eventually need those services.
Okay, great. Now, I was in a charter school in Santa Teresa that focuses on the health sciences and those kinds of fields. Do you feel like schools like that are helpful with looking for job creation and education in general?
Well, I'm pleased by the fact that you're right. In Santa Teresa, there is a new charter school there that is focused on developing health professions and careers. And of course, Las Cruces Public Schools, Gadsden, and others have done the same thing. They've tried to develop programs to try and help younger people realize early in their lives what things interest them. It's been said, of course, that if you do what you love in your job, that you never have to work a day in your life. And I think that's the goal here, is to help young people realize that if they love what they're doing, they're going to succeed. And so programs like the one in Santa Teresa, which help young people early on explore and have experience with those professions, I think is a great thing.
Okay, great. Now, moving a little bit away from education, one of your other bills that I found very interesting and was getting a lot of bipartisan support is the workers' compensation bill that deals with intoxication. Could you talk to me a little bit about what that bill is and what it's going to do in New Mexico?
Sure. New Mexico courts, and I practice law, and so New Mexico courts in the past have determined that our state laws on workers' compensation are a bit vague and ambiguous on one subject, and that is the penalty or the consequence to a worker who's injured when that worker is intoxicated either by alcohol or by controlled drugs. And so the courts have left it to the legislature to try and address that, and I've got legislation this session to try and assure that workers are encouraged to come to work in conditions and under the condition for that job, and so that if a worker is injured as a consequence of intoxication or impairment, that the worker's benefits for workers' compensation would have a corresponding reduction, so that we try and encourage people to come to work in the right condition.
Now, obviously, this is getting a lot of bipartisan support. Are you expecting this to pass?
There's great support behind it. As you pointed out, it's bipartisan, and we also have the support of the Workers' Compensation Commission, which oversees workers' compensation changes. This commission is represented by labor, organized labor, unions, business. We've had representatives from Las Cruces up here lobbying in support of the bill, so I think it has good support, and I think it'll pass.
Okay, now, are other states doing this? I mean, this kind of seems like something that just makes sense. So is this something that other states do have, or is this something that's kind of new?
Well, New Mexico has a unique workers' compensation law, and most states do. Most states have their own systems and their own ways of handling cases, and so I haven't done a comparison to what other states are doing in this area, but the fact remains that New Mexico needs this change in its law, and I'm confident we're going to be able to get it done.
Okay, great. Now, you mentioned that people from Las Cruces were up in Santa Fe lobbying for this. One of the other bills that you did have that already passed and already kind of took effect was Las Cruces Day in Santa Fe. Why is it important to have Las Cruces Day in Santa Fe?
We have this wonderful tradition of having a Las Cruces Day in Santa Fe. Every year, a large group of individuals representing a diverse interests in the city all get together, whether it's the city government, county government, school districts, business community, parents, and average citizens, and they all come up to Santa Fe as a group and have a great deal of influence and impact in Santa Fe doing so as a group. And we spend 3 or 4 days getting to know the legislative process, getting the opportunity to communicate about the current issues that are important to folks back home. And of course, Las Cruces, at about 300 miles away, is sometimes forgotten by Santa Fe, and it's important for Santa Fe to hear from Las Cruces from time to time.
Now, you mentioned talking about issues that are important for southern New Mexico and Las Cruces. What are some of those issues that are specifically important for our area?
Well, you've touched on some of the key issues, Samantha, already, which of course include, as you discussed, water and agriculture. The bigger issues in Las Cruces remain education and our economy. The fact remains that Doña Ana County and Las Cruces remains very low compared to other counties in the state, and the state as a whole is at the lowest in the country for job creation and economic development, and we're just not making any progress. The fact remains that people are leaving the state, and we're not showing job progress that the rest of the country is able to do. We're doing it the wrong way. We're trying to give big breaks to big corporations and hoping that they're going to come in and provide jobs as a cure-all. And those efforts have been unsuccessful. We did a massive corporate tax cut to a very small sector of our economy to attract 1 or 2 businesses, and the result is those businesses have shed jobs and are leaving the state. So we're taking the wrong approach to job creation, and that should be the most important thing to southern New Mexico.
Now, you mentioned those corporate tax breaks. Obviously, New Mexico has a lot of tax breaks. Do you think that's something that needs to be looked at and reformed?
Yes, and there is a lot of work on that. A number of my colleagues are looking at tax breaks that have been passed in years past to try and determine whether they've had the impact or the effect that they were intended to do, which is, of course, to create jobs, or whether they're just a holdover from some good idea maybe decades ago and are no longer something that benefits our economy, and may just be taking money out of our economy when it doesn't really benefit New Mexicans.
Now, is that something that is difficult to study, the effects of these tax breaks?
It's very difficult for legislators because, of course, legislators are part-time and unpaid representatives here in Santa Fe. We don't have staff. We don't really have researchers outside of the session. And then many of the tax breaks are kept confidential. So legislators can't have access to taxpayer information. We don't know in many cases whether tax breaks are working or not working because that information is not shared with us by the state agencies that hold that information.
Now, do you think that's something that could be changed to the process of how those state agencies share information with you?
I do, and in years past, and again this year, I will try and make sure that legislators have better access to information. That includes the ability to compel information or to bring information from state agencies and state directors and secretaries of cabinet positions. Right now, in some cases, cabinet secretaries of this administration have refused to come to legislative committees, refused to come in and present information that we need to do our jobs well. And so I'm trying to work on a better relationship where we can get access to that information and then make better decisions.
Okay, great. Now, I know we've touched on a few of the bills that you have this session, but I know you do have a number more. Is there any that you're specifically excited about or really want to see passed?
You've asked me about Invest 205, and that is the bill that I really have the greatest excitement for, and I hope to see passed. And again, this is to try and recognize that our education system is just not working right now the way it needs to. Albuquerque just posted its graduation rates. They're declining in all but one of the 14 high schools in Albuquerque. Graduation rates are falling badly, in some cases more than 10%. We have increased problems with not only graduation but truancy. And so all of these factors are going to be helped by keeping our children in school more. And adding a modest 25 days to the school year will put New Mexico at a leading place in the country rather than at the bottom.
Now, you mentioned truancy. I saw one of your bills dealt with putting a truancy officer in Las Cruces schools. Could you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yes, the Las Cruces School District and the Superintendent Stan Rounds have asked me to work with them in a program that they've been working on for years, but to try and provide a little bit more funding and assistance. And that's in working with the truancy officers of the District Attorney's Office and also with the school district to try and bring children who are not attending schools to the district and to law enforcement to try and encourage them back into schools. The reality is that we're seeing truancy rates as high as 24% in some senior level classes around the state. 24% of our students are habitually truant. And so truancy and failure to graduate are big issues in New Mexico, and we can combat them by adding the additional 25 days to our school year.
Okay, great. So obviously you've mentioned funding, and the budget is going to be the biggest issue, and it usually is. Could you talk to me a little bit about how you think that budget process is going to go, because we are on such a tight budget this year?
Well, right now I think the budget process is coming along in a way that it typically does. Of course, the House of Representatives is now a majority Republican party, but the relationships there are strong between the chairman of the committees, both in House and Senate. The legislature is being quite a bit more conservative than the executive branch this session. The governor's spending proposals are much higher than the legislature's, and I think that's because legislators are around for, in some cases, decades. They realize that an administration comes and goes, but the legislators are often left behind to try and pick up the pieces. And so the legislature in this session is much more conservative with the projections of oil and gas revenues, and I think that's prudent.
Right. So what do you think is going to be the most important thing to get funding this session?
Education makes up the lion's share of our budget, and so I keep coming back to education, but of course when education represents more than 40%, and depending on whether you include college level, almost as much as 50% of our state budget, then those two are hand in glove. And so working the budget and the educational needs of our state have to go together. And we can't really make cuts to our state funding without recognizing that those have great impacts to things like behavioral health, to public safety and security, and many other things that state provides as services, including medical care through Medicaid. Many of those services are all impacted when we start looking at declining revenues.
Now, you mentioned that the chair in the House and the chair in the Senate do have a good working relationship. I know one is majority Republican and the Senate is majority Democrat. Do you see that as being difficult to kind of get things passed this session, or do you think there is a good working relationship there?
Well, I'm happy that I served 12 years in the House before coming to the Senate, and so many of the colleagues that are in the House now are colleagues that I spent many years with, and we formed those personal relationships and bonds. And so, as you pointed out, I've had success in being able to pass some very significant legislation over the years. I've done so with bipartisan help from my friends in the Republican Party as well as my close friends in the Democrat Party. And I'm confident that I'll be able to do so again this session, working with my friends back in the House.
Now, do you feel that sometimes it isn't so much Democrat, Republican in New Mexico as it is North and South?
Well, there's something to that, sure. The reality is that for those of us that are watching this from southern New Mexico, we're a long distance away. We don't get our broadcast media out of Albuquerque, so people from Doña Ana County and Las Cruces are oftentimes forgotten. We don't get the media and news coverage of what's going on in Santa Fe or what's going on in political campaigns. And the reality is that right now we don't have anyone representing southern New Mexico in the administration in terms of the executive branch cabinet secretaries. And so very oftentimes we're continuing to be left out of the governing process here in Santa Fe. And at the same time, we have people like Senator Mary Kay Papin, who's the President of the Senate from Doña Ana County in the legislature. We have John Arthur Smith, who chairs the budget and finance for the state in the Senate from southern New Mexico. And so we have good representation in the legislature, but we need to assure that that voice is heard throughout the government process, including in the executive or the governor's branch of the government.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for joining us, Senator Cervantes, and I will see you next week on Your Legislators.
Thank you for having me.